We are joined by a guest who now is in the studio. Her name is Kathambi Kaaria, and she's very big. It's one of the ex-bigwigs. No, it's no longer Twitter bigwigs. It's ex-bigwigs.
Ex, not former, but ex.
A Twitter bigwig.
Thank you.
Yeah. Imagine that's what you are. On Twitter, she goes with by the name I am Kathambi. That's the X handle. I am Kathambi. Kathambi, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation.
Thank you.
Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be having a conversation about the just concluded Africa Climate Summit 2023, what's happened around it, the conversations. There are very many conversations in the main hall, the sidelines of this, the private sector, NGOs and everybody, and then the communique that came out yesterday and the resolutions that came out and what's been discussed. Okay? But to welcome you to the conversation, CT is not here for the proverb. Do you remember the proverb, Ndu?
Yes. A young man who travels around the world is older than an old man who remains in the village.
Yes.
Now, that is my interpretation plus salt and pepper, but that's what we said.
That's the proverb,
Thank
actually.
you very much.
It's from Gabon.
A young man who travels around the world.
A young man who travels around the world is older than an old man who remains in the village.
So my interpretation of that is has to do with exposure, and what do they say? When the traveling exposure, experiencing other people, other cultures, sort of gives you more perspective than your little circle of influence.
So you have a lot more. You've learned a lot more despite your age.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
If you compare you to the person who just stayed in one place, hasn't had multiple experiences, your multiplicity of experiences also adds on to your knowledge, your wisdom, your wealth of knowledge and information.
Absolutely.
So, Tembea, that's what basically these Gabonese are saying.
Yeah.
Don't just sit here.
Just sit there from beginning to end.
Yeah. You want to be considered old, and old in this case is wisdom, wise, knowledgeable. Travel.
Some of your experiences. So imagine if your experiences are on a global, global could be around the world, or global could be different parts of Kenya. Some of your experiences now. If some of your experiences is in one place.
That's it. So Kathambi, you are CEO of a company called Credit Advisory, and you're also an expert on climate financing and very many other things. Just take us through, first of all, what is Credit Advisory? Credit Advisory.
So it's basically, what do you say, advisory, but with a very specific focus on Africa, focused advocacy and Africa issues across climate change and policy making, sustainable finance, and mobilizing private sector capital into just transitions, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and so on. But with a very specific focus on Africa.
On Africa?
Yeah.
Why? Why Africa? And how long have you done this?
Well, I've done this my work in climate policy and finance for a very long time, over 10 years. And I think the focus on Africa is just quite simply because the continent needs very dedicated, honest brokers, right? You need people who are invested in the success of the continent. And sometimes that looks, it looks, depending on what the topic of the day is, it can look like anything. It's probably not the solutions that we've come to expect from mainstream sort of capacity or support that is provided, generally speaking, across consulting services. So yeah, I think.
So it's all those things. But then when you talk about climate in this country, and cities here, city amemalizana na delegation. Wamewapatia kila mtu yake wameenda.
Kila mtu amechukua na ameenda. Lakini kuna nyingine bado wanakuja. Wakija tutaona.
Okay. Yes. So, welcome back, City.
Thank you.
Mr. Kathambi is right here just taking us through climate and understanding climate financing from an African perspective. And that's what you say. You focus on Africa because you want to be the champion in the room when Africa is having this conversation on Africa, when there's thinking for Africa and African issues. And it's a big thing because we keep talking about climate financing, but then we see people who are from outside Africa talking about climate finance. We keep talking about what climate change and the impact of climate change, and then climate adaptation and all those things, but we seem to have disjointed voices. Have you experienced that in your 10 years working in this market and on climate?
Yes, of course. I mean, primarily because I think every stakeholder at the table in climate conversations is there to represent their interests, right? So African stakeholders, they want to speak for what's in their best interests. The global north stakeholders want to speak in their best interests. Quite often, these are not sometimes compatible goals, right? And so you do need people who are sitting there and being very stubborn about being, very strong advocates for what their stakeholders need. Yes, to answer your question, yes, there's a huge disconnect, and I think this is part of what we're seeing in terms of the climate conversations. We've been talking about financing climate for the last God knows how long. It's not happening, and it's because of this kind of disconnects. And
are we seeing a shift though? And I think that's one of the things that came out from the very beginning of even a suggestion to have an ACS and to have one on the continent, and for President Ruto to say, look, we're going to have this conversation. We heard certain things being said, but are we seeing that this is shifting a little bit? That for the longest time we've seen talking. It's been talk shops. We're at COP28 this year, for crying out loud. But for somebody from the continent to then open their mouth and make it audible to the world that, look, you know what? You've been shafting us for the last however many years, and we're not going to take that anymore. How about we have a conversation where all the big boys and girls are at the table and everybody gets a chance to say something? Are we seeing a shift in the conversation, or did we just have another talk shop?
It's just concluded yesterday, so it's hard to say. I'm a bit of a cynic because I've been, as I said, over 10 years of doing this. So declarations come and go. I think the deciding factor really has to do with commitment and implementation. That's what we don't see when we talk about from the COP15 Paris agreement. There's a lot of talking. This was also a lot of talking as of now. But what is important also is that I think this was a fantastic opportunity to bring the climate conversation back home to Africa. And the reason I say that is because, you hear the statistic quite often, that Africa is the most impacted by climate change, blah, 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 blah. But if you ask most Africans, a lot of them do not have nuance into what are we talking about when we talk about climate change. And so I think bringing the ACS to Kenya, to Africa, has been so remarkable in terms of spurring the conversation and sort of localizing this conversation about climate change. That's super important. I think the president, to give credit to him, really met this moment. Because, remember, this is happening in the context of the CAOS, the AU Heads of States Committee on Climate Change. And so that's a conversation that has been happening they meet every year, they discuss things, they go to COP. Most of us, if you're not in the climate change space, you do not know what they've been discussing or sort of what common positions have been advanced, right? So this has happened now, and we've had the conversation being brought publicly to the continent, and everyone is part of that. I think that's remarkable.
Is everyone part of it, really?
What I mean, no. Probably not, but what I mean by everyone is part of it is that this has been a very public conversation. Have you heard before of the CAOS meetings?
Actually,
you haven't, right?
No.
But every year at COP28, the AU goes and presents a position on Africa. But most people do not know what that is. So there's value in that process.
When you say we need to have an honest conversation, are you then suggesting that we haven't been having an honest conversation?
We haven't. We probably even haven't had an honest conversation this time.
Good.
But what I'm saying is that we've had a public conversation, and I think that makes a huge difference.
See, I like what you're saying. We at least now can have an honest conversation. When you talk about climate change financing, even that concept alone, climate change financing, what exactly are you financing? Because you talk climate, me, I hear weather.
Okay.
And when I hear weather, I hear rain, I hear sunshine, I hear drought. That's climate as far as I'm concerned. Question number one. When the West talks about climate change, are they talking about the same things we are talking about when we talk about climate change? Because there's the conversation that there's commonality. Where is it?
Okay. Interesting. So climate finance, when we talk about climate financing, you're basically thinking about financing three things, let's say. You're thinking about financing resilience, right? Adaptation and mitigation. Let me explain what that means, right? Is from a layman standpoint, what you're calling weather, right? Is changes in climate accumulating over years. And so what we are talking about when we talk about climate change is how that is impacting our lives now. If you go to a farmer, they'll probably not have the language of climate finance or climate change, but they can tell you how their crops have been affected, how rainfall patterns are changing and affecting, their crops, their land, and so on and so forth. We can see droughts affecting people.
Which means they understand it.
Absolutely.
Yes. So it's also a science communication problem, right? Because it's about distilling this language into very perceptible concepts for general
Easily
audiences.
consumable.
Yes, precisely. But climate finance really just comes down to financing that. And the hard part with climate finance now becomes when you start talking about the issue of revenue.
Yeah.
You see,
and profits.
When you talk climate change and you go historical on it, we've always had climate change.
Yes.
That's why people talk of the ice age. It's an age because it came to an end. We now have yes, it came to an end. We are now talking about some areas of the world that were predominantly ice-ridden, thawing. We are talking about oceans rising. If you want to go back into history, all these things have happened at a certain point in time. The fundamental difference has been the recurrence in the cycle is getting shorter and shorter and shorter.
Yes.
Before it would take a millennia. So several generations would have no clue whatever happened. Now, within one generation, you can see all these changes taking place. Now, I like what you said about science communication. Why is it then that when you look at a local peasant farmer, because they understand climate change, they had bans, meaning they knew a time comes when I may not have enough food and I can't grow it. They'll grow it. They understood the cycles. Why did they prepare for planting? They knew the cycles. They knew at this point in time, I'll be able to plant. They understood it. Okay. Are we saying that understanding, with all these green gas emissions and everything else, that what we understood and the patterns that were known have now changed? Now, what has changed them? And why is it that it's affecting us? Because clearly it has changed. It rains when it's not supposed to rain. The sun shines when it's not supposed to shine. Yeah. We have snow in Nyahururu, something which we were told we should not have. So all these things. Now, how exactly, when we talk about financing resilience, now, if I want a farmer to be protected from all these things, break down this resilience in this farming setup as a peasant and how that can actually be monetized, meaning money getting into my pocket so that when this occurrence, which is adverse, actually takes place, I'm resilient. And the money I have is able to protect me from what is about to come. Because if you start doing that, then you're saying you can predict the changes in climate. And yet, the whole conversation about climate change is the vagaries of it. So where are we really?
Right. Okay. So let me bring in, without getting too sciencey, You're right in the sense that the climate change is temporal. Like we see changes in climate over time. But when you look back at sort of the trends and the patterns of changing climate, what you'll find is that, and to speak to the point of unpredictability now, is that the increase in CO2 emissions as a result of human activity, what they call anthropogenic activity, which coincides with the Industrial Revolution, right, is what led to that increase in CO2 concentration in the air. And as a result, the predictability that we were talking about is no longer as predictable, right? And so this is what the conversation around decarbonization and removing, sort of cutting back on fossil fuels comes down to the resilience question. And again, why the climate conversation is very important is resilience is not an easy thing to finance because there's no profit to be made out of financing resilience, right? If let's say there's a flood and a village is wiped out, the money that, or a farmer's crops are wiped out, the money that steps in for that is not going to be investment from the private sector. It's not going to be what we call, it's not for profit investments, right? So typically this will be grant money, the stuff that, you go ask global governments to, give money for grants and stuff like that. And that's also not sustainable because this is also linked to taxpayer expenditure, right? And so that's why you hear, even from the conversation that the president was talking about, this idea of a global carbon tax, because you need to fund that expenditure from something. And the way to do it, the global carbon tax, which I know people have a problem with the idea of that, but the value of a global carbon tax is that it now
So you're specifically identifying emitters pay into a certain kitty, and then that kitty will be used to fund now those.
Because that's a very difficult thing to fund, right? You have adaptation.
Well, why is it difficult?
Because money moves from
in mysterious ways.
No, because you need sources of public funding. You need a source of public funding. Yes. This money is not going to come from the private sector because the private sector has a profit motivation, right? Adaptation money as well is rarely going to come from the private sector. Adaptation money, to be clear, is the money that we need to adapt to the climate change that's already happening.
Can I just pause you for a second?
Yes.
Private sector, if I'm to go by the discussion we're having, carbon emission and all that, are responsible for all this, aren't they? Industries,
yes, they
private
are.
sector, yes. So now, they would argue they pay taxes. We get that. But the taxes are so that they can conduct their business. The tax does not include the harm that they cause and the attendant financial burdens that come with it. Then comes the concept of CSR. Okay? So when you say they cannot pay, I'm saying, why not?
But you see, now that depends on their benevolence.
Yes, exactly.
And you cannot really force somebody to be benevolent to a certain extent. These are shareholders and private shareholders. If you force them, it becomes that tax, the carbon tax.
Yes.
And you say, because you're emitting X amount of CO2 into the air, then you pay at this rate to a carbon tax. So that way, you are forcing. It's not a conversation of this year, we did not make enough profit. Our shareholders wanted a higher dividend this year, so we are not putting a lot of money into our CSR. Next year, maybe we shall do something. Maybe kuja tuongeleshe next year. So we are saying, it's if the private sector was left to on their own devices or their the abundance of their good heart.
For the private sector.
I do agree with you completely. But you see, where my mind went was for some of these class action cases involving something like, say, the tobacco industry. Okay? Where the harm that tobacco caused was known, but it took a lot of time and a lot of harm and a lot of deaths for people to say, something needs to change here. Now we have this discussion with opioids. Okay. Now, direct harm to human beings leading to death. Now, carbon emission does exactly the same thing, probably on a much grander scale.
Yes.
Now, so I understand the tax element. My discussion is beyond the tax, because tax is obligatory. There's always the understanding, because for this to get to the point where we're saying you are going to pay this tax, it means the argument you propose is absolutely correct. It won't happen if you don't do that. I'm asking the question, must industry necessarily be that particular creation and being that has to be forced to do what is actually right?
So, I mean, in an ideal world, everyone would be decarbonizing their supply chains, right? And shifting to non-polluting, low fossil fuel supply chains. But we understand you're not going to yank out all the fossil fuels. You're not going to shut off gas plants and coal plants overnight. And so the point is that you're doing a couple of things at the same time. You're asking for the decarbonization to happen, but you're also saying these high emitters, and this is not just industries, this is also countries, right? Because the global north, when we talk about decarbonizing, a carbon tax is a disincentive to emit, right? Because if you're paying for emissions, then you start reducing your emissions, right? So that you pay less. The other thing about a global carbon tax, when you look at, say, the global South African countries, is it hits us very little because our emissions are low anyway, right? We are not paying much of global tax. And I think that's when we start negotiating about a global tax, I think African nations need to get behind that because, outside of North Africa and South Africa, who are heavy emitters, the rest of us, we need that. When we are talking about flooding and all these climate-related emergencies, we need a pot of money that can serve us. And that money is not going to be us constantly going to beg folks for grants and to ask for people. Yes.
So when it comes to then adaptation and mitigation, this is where private sector would play when it comes to now climate financing, all right? And it's for profit.
Yeah.
How does that work?
I want to say mitigation more for the private sector rather than adaptation, right? Mitigation is pretty easy. It's a green investment. There's money to be made. If you make it attractive enough for the private sector, they'll come in, they'll invest. Everybody is happy. Adaptation, not so much, because what adaptation does is it creates savings, but it's not necessarily a high revenue activity. Because fundamentally what adaptation is you are financing okay, let me give you an example. Let's say the coastal area needs like a seawall because the sea level is rising, there's going to be floods. There's not much profit for the private sector there. So what you need for adaptation, and this is a critical part of the conversation that was happening, and that needs to happen because Africa's needs are very, very high on adaptation, more than mitigation. So what you need for adaptation financing is finance that is cheap and that is long-term. Typically, this finance will come from multilateral development banks, DFIs, because they have development outcomes as a priority. So they're not, they can make some revenue, but they're not, so this is why people are talking about 1% for 1.5, although that conversation has long passed. But giving these really, really cheap loans, concessional loans for adaptation activities. The thing for Africa is because we are dealing with the impacts of climate change already. A lot of our needs have to do with adaptation, but it's the least funded, right? In 2015, the countries at the Paris summit, at the COP summit, countries agreed to have something called parity, which is 50-50 for climate change adaptation and mitigation. But that hasn't happened because everybody is going to mitigation, which is building new resilient stuff. The African Development Bank, for example, has been remarkable in terms of achieving and exceeding parity, because I think 63% of their financing went to adaptation. At the summit, they also, I think, launched the Adaptation Initiative.
Yeah.
That's and I think that's one of the things that was missing from this climate conversation. Not missing, but it's really what Africa needs. That should have been front and center.
Should have been the bigger thing, the bigger
thing,
agenda.
The bigger agenda. I did see, there's a bit of numbers and sort of asks in the declaration around adaptation, expanding adaptation financing. And what those look like is now this multilateral development banks and expanding concessional financing.
Let's just get straight into that one, right? So they came up with a communique and they said, so we start from this point. This is what we have currently as our issues and our standpoint, and then this is what we now want to push going forward. Do you think the Africa Climate Summit actually delivered on what it was expected to deliver?
So a couple of things it was expected. I expected it to deliver, right?
Right.
The first we've already talked about, which is bringing the conversation back
To Africa.
And having a strong champion, because we haven't had that. If you look across the landscape, the continental landscape, really, we haven't had a strong voice for this climate action and sort of the climate direction for Africa. And so I think we got that in the president. I think he met the moment really well, to give credit to him. Now, the meat and potatoes of the declaration itself, right? Remember, it's flowing from the summit that was held in Paris in July. Yeah. And a lot of these declarations are actually part of that process. It's important that they are now, because before, these are summit declarations that were made in Paris, and where's the Africa in that? So bringing them and contextualizing them to the African context is important. So I think the summit has achieved that. The content of them, I expected to see progress in terms of just moving from the same things that were stated in Paris, showing up again in the Nairobi Declaration. I don't know, I expected a bit of momentum. And the reason is because when you've been in this space for a long time, you realize very quickly that nothing gets done unless there's commitment to implement stuff.
Oh, absolutely,
right?
Kathambi. I mean, look, even if you haven't been in the space, let's look between Scotland for COP26, Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, going to Dubai, COP28. In 2 years, what has been talked about has not been done. Let's look between November 2022 and November 2023, that is fast approaching. What movement has been made beyond the declarations that came out of Sharm el-Sheikh? And the truth of the matter is that we can unequivocally say zero. And that's the truth. There have been talk shops, there have been people saying things, and my hope, my desire, and I said this at the beginning of last week, before people came to Nairobi, that as African leaders are coming together, whether the intention is genuine or not, we saw the reaction that came from the West. Everybody was clamoring to come to Nairobi to be part of this conversation. And if anything, it's something that should fuel action by African leaders and governments moving forward. That all you have to do is come together, and everybody's peeping from their doors and asking, what's going on in Africa, and wants to be part of the conversation. We should be the ones to lead this conversation about the things that concern us. And it's not just climate, it's other things as well. But now that we're talking about climate, we should be able to lead in the things that concern us and make tangible, valuable decisions based on the realities that we see. I personally believe that the reason why these talk shops continue to be talk shops is because the real interest is to have people talking while you keep doing whatever it is that you want to do. And if you ask me, they've achieved that very well. But if African governments, leaders, organizations within Africa, bilateral, unilateral, multilateral, are having these conversations and following them with action, we don't need financing from the north for adaptation in the south. We don't. We don't need their money. We have it here.
Where?
We don't. Where
We have the money.
We have resources here.
Show us. Show me.
We have
Actually,
resources here.
You continue. I will show you where the money
We
is.
have
I agree
resources
with you
here
there.
that we apply to things that don't bring about the necessary development that we go and cry about tomorrow. And we go and have conversations, and we are not able to make decisions that are going to better develop us here. And if you ask me, that's one of the things that I think that is being pushed for. When we're at the table and negotiating, how are we negotiating? In whose interests are we negotiating? Knowing full well that those conversations are happening, to keep conversations happening, but nothing is being done.
Yeah. You've raised a really important point on where's the money for adaptation. Like we in an ideal world, we would have the money for adaptation, but we don't. And I think part of the bigger conversation on reforming, everyone is talking about, we need to reform the global financial architecture, right? This feeds into that conversation, especially if you think about debt servicing, right? Where are you going to have the money to adapt to climate change if all your money is tied up in servicing debt, for example, right? It's not even, you're not even going to have money to forget even adaptation, healthcare, food, education, right? And so that big conversation about we are reforming the global financial architecture feeds into all of these things. Asking for debt restructuring and fair debt and sort of all of those things.
Can I ask, why do you think the North and the West keep coming to Africa? Why do they keep coming here?
Why do they even give us money in the first
Why do they
place?
give us money in the first place? Why if President
good
William
market for the
Ruto calls a summit, they want to become amicus climate? Why do they keep coming?
I think because, like we said at the beginning, is that they are interested stakeholders, right?
Because?
Well, because they are interested in the African continent.
I think we are still resource rich.
Yes.
And we are still the greatest resource on the globe.
And
Richest in terms of resources.
And they know this.
Still greatest in Africa.
Yeah.
And they know this.
Yeah.
They also are well aware of our ability to mismanage the function of those resources. And I'm saying that it's about time that we took control of the management of that. And that's where the money is.
Yes, but isn't that a process though? Like how do you go from
How long should this process take?
How long
what
do we
does
need
that
to give them?
what does that process look like for you? If I was to say, okay, take us there, right? How would you just map that out for
In the
me?
thinking, and it starts there.
Okay, so you've thought about it.
No,
How do you execute?
Okay, look, let's an example right here in Kenya. When we say that you talk about health and you talk about food and you talk about nutrition, right here in Kenya, the floods are coming. El Nino is knocking.
Yes.
It's about to come.
Yeah.
For 10 years, there have been droughts in this country that nobody has really thought about. Disaster management has not been an issue because, it doesn't really matter. If you talk about management of resources, it's in the mind, and you have to be serious about putting in things that will help to mitigate some of these things. You want to be serious about putting your money behind disaster management. You want to be serious about using the resources that you have and then being able to make something from them and put in policies that will be followed by implementation. And people from the outside looking in can see that you're serious about the thing that you have.
Yes.
They'll think twice about coming to talk to you about whether they're going to give you money tomorrow and charge you an arm and a leg for it.
Okay.
And
So
that's what I'm talking
fund
about,
that.
thinking into management.
Fund that thinking, because it will only come to fruition if you implement it. So yes, we know that floods are coming. Okay. The measures that I'm thinking, that I think you're talking of, is how do we harvest this water so that how do we make sure that it doesn't affect as many people? How do we do all those things? How shall we have resilience for the communities that are going to be affected by the flooding? That's money. Where's the money?
Actually, it's budgeted for every year. It's just not put into what it is budgeted for. Because what are we talking about? Dredging rivers. Because over time, that siltation reduces the capacity of rivers. Water pans and all these water collection points that we have, which have filled up over time, ensuring that over time people have the ability to harvest that water. It's not these multi-billion dam projects that we're talking about, number one. Number two, if you were to ask the question and answer it in one statement for a country like Kenya, when we budget for things, can we just do what we said? Because yes, because even when you talk about this management here in this country, we understand full well what needs to be done. We even again budget for it.
Yeah.
But the reason why we keep talking about the problem, because it's never done.
Yes. So that's those are two. I mean, you both raise really important points, and I think it's around governance.
Yeah.
If you ask me, the Nairobi, one of the things that should have come out of the Nairobi Declaration is what responsibility are African leaders taking for this conversation? 100%. That did not come out. And the reason I say that is because we can have all the conversations we want about, debt is expensive, you're overpricing Africa's risk. And yes, there are some risks that are real and some risks that are perceived, as they say. But the risks of, there's corruption risk, political risk, rule of law risks, all these kind of things, right? And MDBs are really good at taking away some of the perceived risks. But there are real risks that you guys are bringing up on governance, corruption, transparency, accountability with resources, right? And I think that should have come out, because you can't keep asking everybody else to do something and you're not pulling your weight. So yes, I think that governance and accountability in terms of resource management is extremely important. It's
but
piece
remember,
of the puzzle.
where the false conversation takes place, you see all the lovely, loud, disruptive statements that we heard. Good. The real action in these conferences are the behind-the-scenes conversations.
Okay.
What we do, who gets what, and how they get it. Now, the Business Daily has tried to sort of like sum it up. We're talking about amounts that have been pledged and what have you, and so forth. That's part of the story.
Yeah.
Behind the pledges, there's always another discussion. What our partners in the West cannot do in their own countries, they can do here. Meaning, even as we cut these deals to help us, anyone who is a deal maker and a business person will ensure that they benefit from it. We've seen the West doing this with this matter of climate change and the mitigation. What do? You set up a factory in Africa, because then when you look at the emissions of carbon in your country, it's supposedly reduced because you are no longer doing it, but you're doing it elsewhere. I'm calling it the false note in this conversation. See, we have to take a stand that we are not known to take. The president has started by that disruptive conversation, well-timed, appropriate, apt. Now, the actions that follow, so that you actually show that when you say you're going to do something, you actually do it. Now, that we have not been able to do. So long as we're not able to do it, this conversation that we are having here, this is an academic exercise.
So collectively as a continent, we have not been able to do it?
Collectively as a continent, we have not been able to do it. Collectively in the sense that if you look at country by country by country, and even the problems that they have, a lot of it has to do with them not doing what they're supposed to do.
Okay. And yet collectively as the global north, they've been able to do what they're doing?
Collectively, they've been able to do it. That is actually the bottom line, because they've long understood.
So why?
Huh?
To do what? Kathambi is asking to do what?
They've understood.
They've not done the decarbonization for sure.
No, because they haven't needed to. Now
it is to players.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
They've been able to
to
run the show.
Yes.
And we've been unable to take the reins of the show because We do.
We've not been able to look after our own interest. We've been able to take the pittance that drop from the table and they present to us as what we
and
need.
not sorting out issues in the backyard.
Yes.
And that's
Yeah.
the thing.
They've understood
How
this.
will you go? They understand also that it is very difficult for you to come to the table and have a prudent conversation about some of these things, make demands which could be well within your own right as those who suffer the most from a problem that you did not participate the most in creating.
Yeah.
They also know that in your backyard you've not sorted out a number of things, so that lessens your potency when you're having the conversation on the table. How do you come and tell people on a global scale we should do 1, 2, 3 when the people in your country are suffering from the effects of a drought that has been there for 20 years?
Kathambi, let me give you an example, for instance, in the field of, say, medical research. The narrative that you will hear is that the research is meant to benefit us, and we do benefit to some degree, and that it'll help us. It does help us, but why then don't they conduct the research projects in their own countries? They also have human beings in their countries. Why? Why are we the only continent that has human beings?
So, I mean, I think part of these conversations is that
I am simply saying there are things you can get away with when you come to countries like India. Put their foot down on many issues. Look at the pharmaceutical world, for instance, and some of these rules that the West puts in terms of patents and what have you. India and China told them to go suck a lemon a long time ago when it comes to some of these matters. Okay? And they figured, quantity, it's what? It's a drug. We can figure this thing out. I'm simply saying, and where do you think India is now? India is not a third world country.
So what I'm not getting is exactly, because problems take money to solve, right?
Problems don't take money
So-
to solve, my dear. Problems take the willingness to take those bold steps.
And money.
No. The money is just a tool. If the money is available and that willingness isn't there, we have money in this country. My dear, there are few countries that have been pillaged like this country, and we still stand, which means we have a hell of a lot of money. Now, imagine if that money went to what it's supposed to do. Where do you think we would be?
So, look, in the context of a climate change conversation, we're not having two different. I'm not disagreeing with you, right? And these are contemporaneous issues. We can talk about good governance and
Who again?
simultaneous happening at the same time. Eh?
I mean, simultaneously.
Yes, exactly.
Big brother.
No, like, she will lose her train of thought.
Yes,
Okay, sorry.
exactly.
I apologize.
They can happen at the same time, which is we can promote good governance, and that's a very critical part of achieving climate action. But there is a responsibility for the global north to finance and to decarbonize,
100%.
right, at scale, which is why things like this. And to the question of whether this was actually an Africa climate summit, is why the question of these things like voluntary carbon offsets and things like that they're pretty rubbish at decarbonizing anything, right? So they shouldn't have even been. In fact, the position should have been get these things out of here,
Right.
Right? Because what they are doing is just delaying progress and just giving the polluters a carte blanche to keep polluting.
How do you get the West to actually understand comprehensively the responsibility they have? Because they don't actually. And if they do, they ignore it.
understand very well. They understand very well.
I think they
right?
want you to think they don't.
Yes.
But they do.
I think they understand very well. But the stakeholders, the invested interests in a world that's not decarbonized are also very strong, right?
Actually.
Those industries, they are lobbyists. It's a very strong thing to it's a huge disruption.
What do they
And so it
understand?
will meet the resistance.
I'm hearing, but what do they really understand?
City, you think they do not know that in the world of industrialization, you think they do not know the responsibility that they
they
bear,
do.
or that the
Oh, they
contribution that they made to
They do.
what Kathambi Asona
They
explained
do.
about now emissions and what that has done to the
They
rest of
do.
the world. They
They
get
do.
that.
Oh,
Now,
What do you think they don't understand?
you think they don't
Siti?
understand their responsibility when it comes to now forking out the lion's share of compensations when it comes to now sorting out some of these issues? They get that. They do not want to. We always say that there are very many nations
No.
who will do things based on their interest. Is
Yes.
their interest in forking out more dollars to get
No.
something done? No, it's not.
They don't feel they don't need to, not want to, need to. Because if they felt they needed, not want, you realize it's incumbent upon you and it's in your interest to do so. See, this conversation that the president has had has brought that conversation on board. They've realized, wait a moment, This divisive tactics, these guys are getting the act together and they begin to figure out that they can talk as one voice.
Right.
So-
and not just on climate.
Yes,
They can come-
because this parade that we saw here, it was not for nothing. It's that understanding that perhaps this thing is beginning to change and it may not necessarily work for us if we don't get our acts together and come. So you're asking, what don't they understand? They probably didn't figure that the Africans might get to a point where they say, you know something, this is good enough, but we actually ought to do these things on our own. Okay? And mean it. Not say it, mean it. Now that, they hadn't quite figured. Because if they had figured it out, this race and this crowding that we saw in these last 3 days would not have occurred. Something shook them some when they figured this thing may not be quite working the way we thought.
I think that the only thing that can shake the global north into action, really at this point, because I'm very exasperated, is extreme weather events. The stuff that we're seeing, the flooding, the fires, right? That's the stuff that will shock them into action. Because the status quo is very comfortable. You realize that for the global north, right? No one wants to go without their highly
their
fossil
power.
fuel,
Yep.
their high fossil fuel powered conveniences.
Yep.
It's a very difficult thing to do, right? I'll tell you, start hopping on, stop driving your Range Rover and start hopping on the metro, whatever. It's uncomfortable,
Yeah.
right? The thing that will compel them is the climate
If
change
they
impact that
also
we're seeing.
get the effect
If
of
they feel the effect of climate change, then they'll decarbonize for
And are we
themselves.
starting to see it already?
We are,
extended
because-
summers,
yes.
extended flooding,
Extreme
nature
heat,
underwater,
yes.
extreme heat, and they're starting
The
to feel
flooding,
it.
and I think it's nature's way of just saying, you know what,
come on.
let's equalize this thing because because I mean
It's been going on for
been
a while.
For a while, yes.
Kathambi, we thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so it was your first time. Come again.
I shall.
Sindio?
Yes.
It was fun.
It was.
Yeah.
Thank
Kathambi
you.
Kaaria is an expert on climate financing, focusing in Africa through her company Creed Advisory. She's been our guest looking back into the ACS 2023 and what came out of it and all the conversations about climate and climate action. Keep it here for more conversations. Remember, on the 29th of October, Kathambi will join us at Uhuru Gardens, flagging off of the Standard Chartered Nairobi Marathon. The 20th edition of this is taking place.
Creating the right kind of energy.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Run.
There's
So
even
register
people
today.
walking, but
NairobiMarathon.com.
Maybe I'm a walker more than I am a runner.
It's okay, just join us.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.